Did you know that more than 80% of people in the Middle Ages were peasants? That means the story of medieval life isn't knights in shining armour or kings on gilded thrones. It's mud, hunger, smoke, and endless labour. To be a peasant was to live at the very bottom of the ladder, your back bent under someone else's wealth. Hey guys, tonight we're going to peel back the illusions of the Middle Ages and walk straight into the huts, fields, and filthy routines of the peasants who kept the entire system running. Forget the fairy tale villages from storybooks. We're talking about lice crawling in your hair, smoke burning your lungs, and working from dawn until your body broke, all for a loaf of bread and a lord's taxes. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these late-night dives into history's dirtiest corners. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Always wild to me how people all over the world drift off to sleep with stories that would have kept peasants awake in terror. Now, dim the lights, pull your blanket a little closer, and imagine this. You wake before dawn, not to an alarm, but to the sound of a rooster crowing and the stink of animals sleeping beside you. Your hut is little more than mud walls and a leaking thatched roof. The floor is packed earth, damp with urine and manure. Smoke hangs thick in the air from a fire that barely survived the night, your eyes stinging as you breathe. In the corner, your children stir, coughing. A pig roots around the straw, and chickens flutter above your head, their droppings speckling the beams. There's no breakfast waiting, maybe a crust of yesterday's black bread, hard as stone, dipped in watered-down ale if you're lucky. You stretch your stiff limbs, already sore because your day will be nothing but labour, the same labour that chained your parents and their parents before them. You don't own this hut, these fields, or even your own time. Everything belongs to the Lord, whose manor rises just beyond the village. You are his labour, his rent, his tax, and that's just the start of your day. Being a medieval peasant wasn't picturesque simplicity. It was backbreaking, filthy, and short-lived. Life expectancy was low, death always close, and dignity nearly impossible. But this was the reality for most people in medieval Europe. And tonight we're going to live it. If you picture a medieval village from movies, you probably imagine cosy cottages with flowers in the windows and smoke curling peacefully from chimneys. Forget that. The home of a peasant wasn't a cottage, it was a hovel, and calling it a house was generous. Most peasants lived in single-room huts made of wattle and daub, sticks woven together and plastered with mud, straw, and manure. The walls cracked easily, letting in draughts and rain. In winter, icy winds whistled through the gaps, and in summer, flies swarmed the sticky surface. The roof was thatched straw, always threatening to leak or collapse. A strong storm could rip it apart, and when that happened, there was little to do but patch it with more straw, mud, or dung. Inside, the floor was packed earth, often mixed with manure. Some families scattered straw to soften it, but that just soaked up filth and made the smell worse. There were no separate rooms, no privacy. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents all lived together in one smoky, crowded space. The hearth was the centre of the hut, a pit or simple stone circle where fire burned almost constantly, but there was no chimney, only a hole in the roof to let smoke escape. More often it filled the room, stinging eyes and blackening walls. Children coughed relentlessly, their lungs scarred before they were even grown. Still, without that smoke, families would freeze. Furniture was scarce. A crude table, a couple of stools, maybe a wooden chest if you were lucky. Beds, as we know them, didn't exist. Families slept on straw mattresses stuffed with rushes or hay, crawling with fleas and lice. The smell of damp wool blankets mixed with sweat, smoke, and animal dung. Comfort was a fantasy. And yes, animals lived inside too. Goats, pigs, chickens, sometimes even cows shared the same roof. Their body heat helped keep the hut from freezing, but their filth made the air unbearable. Dung piled in corners, urine soaked into the floor. Chickens shat from rafters above. The line between home and barn didn't really exist. There were no toilets. Peasants used chamber pots, which were emptied into the street or into open ditches. In the worst cases, waste was simply dumped outside the door, where it mixed with mud until it froze into foul ridges in winter or turned to slime in spring. The stench of human waste never left the village. Light came from the fire or from tallow lamps, small clay pots filled with animal fat. They smoked, smelled rancid, and gave weak light. Candles were too expensive for most peasants. Nights were dark, suffocating, and filled with the sounds of coughing, farting, snoring, and animals shifting in the straw. And yet, despite the filth, the hut was everything. It was shelter from storms, a place to huddle against cold, a fragile bubble of family in a brutal world. Children grew up pressed shoulder to shoulder with their siblings, listening to their parents argue, laugh, pray, and sometimes cry. The hut was the stage where every part of life played out. Birth, sex, sickness, and death all happened in the same smoky room. Imagine lying there at night. The fire is dying, leaving only a faint glow. Smoke burns your eyes. A pig grunts nearby. A child coughs weakly. You scratch at lice biting your scalp. The blanket stinks of mildew. Outside, wolves howl in the dark. And you know this same hut, this same stench and smoke, will be your world until the day you die. This wasn't a cosy cottage. It was survival, barely. If there was one thing that defined the life of a medieval peasant, it was work. Endless, back-breaking, repetitive work. From the moment the rooster crowed to the moment the sun dipped, every day was consumed by labour. Rest was a fantasy, and leisure almost didn't exist. A peasant's work depended on the season, but there was no time of year without toil. In spring, fields had to be ploughed and sown. Men and oxen strained against wooden ploughs that barely cut the earth. The soil was heavy, the tools crude, and the work relentless. Bent backs, blistered hands, mud caked on bare legs. This was the beginning of the agricultural cycle. Summer meant weeding, reaping, and constant tending. Crops had to be protected from pests, fences patched, animals grazed, hay was cut, dried, and stacked for winter. The sun burned sweat-soaked tunics, and dehydration was constant. Yet peasants still pushed through, because every stalk of grain mattered. Autumn was harvest. Families rose before dawn and didn't stop until night. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats had to be gathered, threshed, and stored. This was the most crucial time. Enough food had to be put aside to last the village through winter, or starvation followed. Work was frantic, fields buzzing with sickles slicing and bundles stacked. Even children joined in, dragging sheaves, shooing away birds. Winter brought a different rhythm, but it was no less harsh. Wood had to be chopped and hauled, animals fed and sheltered, roofs patched against snow. Men trudged into frozen forests to cut timber, while women spun wool, repaired clothes, or brewed ale. There was no such thing as a quiet winter. Survival demanded constant effort, and this wasn't paid work. A peasant didn't labour for wages. They worked their lord's land, paying rent in the form of crops, animals, or days of unpaid service. The manor demanded its due, and the church added tithes on top. That meant peasants worked not just for themselves, but for everyone above them in the hierarchy. Whatever scraps remained after taxes and dues were all they had for survival. The body bore the cost. Men and women alike developed bent spines, twisted joints, and permanent calluses. Malnutrition weakened bones and teeth, leaving mouths full of rot. A fall in the fields, a cut from a sickle, even a sprained ankle could ruin a family, because there was no time to heal. You worked or you starved. Children weren't spared. By the age of 5 or 6, they were already in the fields, chasing crows, carrying water, or gleaning leftover grain. Play was rare, and usually just another form of work disguised as a game. Childhood ended as soon as you could lift a tool. Imagine the routine. Dawn breaks and you're already in the fields, dew soaking your feet, stomach empty, but body moving anyway. The day stretches endlessly. Ploughing, weeding, reaping, hauling, bending, lifting, sweating. Your back screams, your hands bleed, but there is no stopping. Only when the sun dips and darkness falls do you stumble home, aching, hungry, and ready to collapse on a lice-ridden mattress. This cycle never ended. Day after day, year after year, until age or injury broke you. And for many peasants, age meant barely 40. Work wasn't just what peasants did, it was who they were. Their lives were defined by labour, and their deaths often caused by it. Forget the images of medieval banquets piled high with roasted meat and golden goblets of wine. That was the life of lords. For peasants, food was repetitive, meagre, and often unsanitary. Eating wasn't about enjoyment, it was about survival, and survival was rarely guaranteed. The cornerstone of the peasant diet was bread. But this wasn't fluffy white bread. It was coarse, heavy, and often black, made from rye, barley, or oats, mixed with whatever filler could stretch the flour further. Ground beans, peas, acorns, even sawdust in desperate times. The bread was dense, sour, and often mouldy. A single loaf might have to last a family several days. Porridge and gruel came next. Barley or oats boiled into a thick sludge, sometimes flavoured with a pinch of herbs if available. It filled stomachs but offered little nutrition. Meat was a luxury most peasants tasted only a few times a year, usually at festivals or feasts when animals were slaughtered. For most meals, meat was replaced by salted herring or dried fish, often half rotten and crawling with worms. Vegetables played a role, but variety was scarce. Turnips, cabbages, onions, and beans were staples, boiled until mush. Potatoes and corn didn't exist yet in Europe. Fruits were seasonal and rare. Apples in autumn, berries in summer, and almost never lasted through winter. Dairy products helped when animals were healthy. Milk, butter, and cheese appeared in small amounts, though they spoiled quickly in the smoky huts. Sour milk was common, often drunk even when it had curdled into a foul-smelling sludge. For children, it was sometimes the only nourishment available. Drinks were equally telling. Water was rarely safe to drink, so ale was the staple beverage. But don't imagine frothy pints. This was small ale, weakly brewed, sour, barely alcoholic, and consumed daily by adults and children alike. Stronger ale and wine were luxuries reserved for wealthier villagers or the manor, and always hunger-haunted meals. Even in good years, food was monotonous and insufficient. In bad years, famine swept through villages, bread shrank to thinner slices, broth grew weaker, children cried through the night. People scavenged for roots, nuts and weeds, sometimes boiling grass or chewing bark to ease hunger pains. Chronicles even whisper of cannibalism in the harshest famines, parents abandoning children, bodies disappearing from shallow graves. Malnutrition left marks on every body. Peasants were short, their bones stunted by lack of protein. Their teeth rotted early, leaving mouths black and painful. Bellies swelled with worms, a result of eating poorly stored grain infested with larvae. Fevers, rickets, and weakness were constant companions. Imagine sitting down to dinner in a smoky hut. On the table is a crust of black bread, so hard you must soak it in sour ale before biting. Beside it, a pot of gruel bubbles, grey and bland. A child picks at a turnip, another cries from hunger. You chew slowly, forcing yourself to swallow, knowing this is all there is until tomorrow. Outside, the Lord feasts on venison and wine, but you will never taste such things. Food for peasants wasn't comfort, it wasn't joy, it was a daily reminder of their poverty and a gamble with survival. If the endless labour and meagre food weren't enough, medieval peasants lived under another burden just as heavy as hunger. Obligation. Everything they had, their homes, their crops, their animals, even their own bodies, was tied to the lord of the manor and to the church. Survival wasn't just about fighting nature, it was about paying dues to powers above them. A peasant's land wasn't really his. Most peasants were serfs bound to their lord's estate. They could not leave without permission, could not sell their land, and could not choose another master. In exchange for their plots, they owed rent, usually in the form of crops or labour. That meant the grain they sweated for all summer wasn't theirs to eat. Much of it went straight to the manor granary. On top of this came labour services. Several days a week, peasants had to leave their own fields to work the lord's domain, the estate lands. They ploughed his fields, harvested his grain, mended his fences, repaired his roads. If they refused, punishment could mean fines, beatings, or worse. The lord's needs always came first, and then came taxes. Fees were demanded for almost everything. Want to grind your grain? You pay to use the Lord's mill. Want to bake bread? You pay to use the communal oven, which he controlled. Want to press grapes into wine? You pay to use his press. Marriage? A fee. Inheritance? A fee. Even the death of a family member was taxed. The best animal in the household was often taken as a mortuary fee. As if that weren't enough, the church also demanded its share. The tithe, 1/10 of everything produced, belonged to God, or rather to the parish priest. Grain, eggs, wool, or money, it didn't matter. The church claimed it all, and if you failed to pay, you didn't just risk worldly punishment, you risked your soul. The fear of excommunication hung heavy, a spiritual death as frightening as hunger. For peasants, this double burden was suffocating. They laboured endlessly, yet the fruits of that labour disappeared into the hands of lords and priests. Families went hungry, not because they hadn't worked, but because they had nothing left after dues were taken. Resentment simmered. Peasants cursed under their breath, muttered about greedy priests and fat lords feasting, while children starved. But open rebellion was rare and dangerous. Lords had soldiers, priests had divine authority. Still, across the centuries, there were peasant uprisings, sudden explosions of rage, when hunger and injustice grew too heavy. Fields were abandoned, barns torched, manor houses stormed. Most were crushed brutally, leaving corpses hanging in village squares as warnings. Yet most peasants endured. They had no choice. To live as a peasant was to live squeezed from above and below, nature crushing you with hunger, lords and priests draining you with taxes. Imagine it. You haul sacks of grain to the manor barn, sweat freezing on your brow, your stomach already empty. The steward counts your bushels, takes the best, and leaves you with scraps. Days later, the priest arrives, demanding his 10th. You hand over eggs and wool, bow your head, and bite your tongue. Your children cry at night, but you dare not withhold a single dew. The Lord owns your body, the church owns your soul, and between them there is almost nothing left for you. This was the weight peasants carried every day of their lives, and it made survival far more than a battle with the seasons. It was a battle with the entire system. For the medieval peasant, faith wasn't a choice. It was the framework of reality itself, a net that caught every moment of life, from birth to death. The church was everywhere, in the ringing of bells in the festivals, in the tithes paid, in the fear of demons at night. Religion offered comfort, yes, but more often it reminded peasants of their powerlessness. Every week peasants trudged to the parish church. The building dominated the village, a stone monument among wooden huts, its spire reaching for heaven, while the people below grovelled in mud. Inside the air was thick with incense, the Latin chants incomprehensible to most. Peasants couldn't read scripture, couldn't question sermons, couldn't interpret God's word. The priest controlled all of it. His words shaped their fears and their hopes. The church demanded obedience through rituals. Baptism marked birth, confession cleansed sins, marriage tied families, funerals sealed souls. Each came with fees, offerings, or gifts to the priest. The cycle was relentless. You gave to the church when you were born, you gave while you lived, and you gave when you died. Fear was central. Hell was preached vividly, with flames, devils, and endless torment. Every sin, even small ones, a stolen egg, a curse muttered at the Lord, threatened eternal damnation. Demons were said to lurk in forests, in storms, in illness. Witches, the priest warned, walked among villages, cursing crops or stealing milk. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams. They were attacks of demons pressing on your chest. Superstition blended seamlessly with doctrine. Charms of bone or herbs hung in huts, crosses carved into doors, holy water sprinkled on fields. A feverish child was both prayed over and given folk remedies. The lines blurred because peasants couldn't separate official religion from old pagan fears. To them, both were survival tools. Festivals were the rare moments of light. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, these broke the monotony with music, dancing and food. But even here, the church was present, reminding peasants that joy came only through God. And if the harvest failed or storms ruined fields, priests said it was punishment for sin. Guilt pressed on already weary shoulders. Imagine kneeling in a freezing church in January. Your breath fogs the air, your knees ache against stone, your belly gnaws with hunger. The priest warns of hellfire, of demons waiting for the weak. You clutch your wooden rosary, whispering prayers you barely understand, hoping God spares you another winter of misery. Around you, villagers bow their heads too, each carrying the same fear. Religion gave meaning to suffering, but it also justified it. Lords ruled by divine right, priests demanded obedience as God's messengers, and peasants were told their hunger was holy patience rewarded only in heaven. This belief held the social order together. Without it, peasants might have risen sooner, fought harder. With it, they endured. For medieval peasants, God was everywhere, in the bells, in the fear, in the hunger, in the hope. Faith was both comfort and chain. If you imagine children running freely through flower-filled meadows, carefree and laughing, erase that picture. Childhood for a medieval peasant was short, brutal, and rarely innocent. To be born into a peasant family was to begin life already in debt to hunger, disease, and work. From the moment of birth, survival was uncertain. Infant mortality was staggering. Some historians estimate that 1 out of 3 children died before reaching the age of 5. Smoke-filled huts suffocated newborn lungs, infection spread easily, and malnutrition starved tiny bodies. Mothers swaddled infants in rough cloth, pressing them close for warmth, but many never survived their first winter. Those who lived were set to work almost as soon as they could walk. By the age of 5 or 6, children carried water, gathered sticks for fuel, herded geese, or gleaned grain left behind in fields. They weren't spared because of age. Every pair of hands mattered when survival was always on the edge. Education didn't exist for most peasant children. They couldn't read or write. Stories were their only school. Folk tales told by mothers at the hearth, sermons preached by priests, gossip whispered in fields. Knowledge came through repetition. How to milk a goat, mend a roof, tie a snare. Childhood was an apprenticeship in survival. Play existed, but it was crude and often tied to work. Bones became dice, sticks became swords, mud turned into toys. Children laughed, but always under the weight of hunger and chores. A child's game might end when a pig wandered off, or when an older sibling was beaten for neglecting work. Family life was tight and crowded. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and animals all shared the same smoky hut. Privacy didn't exist. Babies cried through the night. Parents quarrelled in front of children, and sickness spread like wildfire. Bonds were strong, but strain was constant. Marriage came young. Girls might be promised at 12 or 13, boys a little older. Weddings weren't lavish, just contracts between families, sometimes approved by the Lord. Love wasn't the foundation, survival and alliances were. A girl left her childhood bed behind and stepped straight into motherhood. Many died giving birth before their 20th birthday. Death surrounded children, shaping their world. They buried siblings, watched parents cough blood, saw animals slaughtered. Death wasn't hidden, it was a daily reality. Children grew up fast because innocence was impossible when survival pressed from every side. And yet, even in misery, there were moments of joy. Mothers sang lullabies while spinning wool. Fathers carved toys from scraps of wood. Children chased each other in fields after chores, laughing despite hunger. These flashes of humanity were fragile, but they existed. Imagine being 6 years old in a peasant hut. You wake on straw that smells of dung, scratching fleas from your arms. Your breakfast is a crust of black bread dipped in sour ale. Afterward, you're sent to herd geese through muddy lanes, the cold biting your bare feet. You carry a stick, waving it wildly when the birds scatter. You're hungry, tired and small, but no one pities you. Childhood isn't protection. It's training for a lifetime of the same. For peasant children, life was short and harsh. Innocence didn't last. Survival demanded too much. Forget the elegant gowns of noble women or the bright heraldic tunics of knights. The clothing of medieval peasants was simple, rough, and often disgusting by modern standards. Clothes weren't fashion, they were survival, and they carried the dirt, lice, and stink of everyday life. Most peasants owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes, often passed down through families until they fell apart. Tunics and dresses were made of coarse wool or linen, itchy and heavy, dyed in dull browns, greys or off-whites. Bright colours were rare, reserved for festivals, and often made from cheap plant dyes that faded quickly. Clothes didn't flatter the body, they covered it barely. Men wore tunics belted at the waist with hose or rough leggings if they could afford them. Women wore long dresses, sometimes with aprons or shawls. Children ran around in miniature versions, though many went half naked in summer, their tunics falling to rags. In winter, Everyone wrapped themselves in layers of patched cloaks, skins, and anything they could scavenge. Shoes were a luxury. Many peasants went barefoot year-round, their feet toughened by mud and frost. When shoes existed, they were simple leather pieces, crudely stitched, often leaking and rotting in damp weather. Holes were patched with cloth or straw. Cold feet were a constant misery. Underclothes, almost non-existent. Linen shifts or shirts might serve as the single underlayer, rarely washed. Wool scratched directly against the skin, collecting sweat, fleas, and filth. Bathing was infrequent, sometimes only a few times a year, so clothes absorbed everything. Sweat, smoke, grease, manure. The smell clung. Lice and fleas infested every layer. Combs made of wood or bone were used, but infestations were inevitable. Children scratched constantly, their scalps red and raw. Adults burned infested clothes or boiled them when they could, but the pests always returned. Vermin were part of the wardrobe. Head coverings were common. Women wore kerchiefs, hoods, or wimples, not just for modesty, but to keep hair out of smoke and vermin away. Men wore felt hats, caps, or hoods. Haircuts were crude, done with knives or shears, often hacked unevenly. Dirt and grease glued hair together. Beards grew wild, trimmed only with fire or rough blades. Appearance marked class immediately. A lord might ride through a village in silks or furs, gleaming with wealth. A peasant stood in mud, his tunic ragged, his face weathered, his hands cracked. Even from a distance, the difference was obvious. Smell carried before sight. Clothes also carried symbolic weight. A peasant's cloak or dress often showed their labour. Blackened sleeves from the hearth, grass stains from fields, blood from animals slaughtered. Clothes were as much a record of survival as a shield against weather. Festivals were the rare exceptions. On holy days, peasants patched their best tunic, washed their faces, maybe even borrowed a cloak. Women braided hair, rubbed in herbs to mask odours, tied ribbons if they could. For a few hours, they could pretend to be more than mud-stained labourers, but the illusion never lasted. Work and dirt always returned. Imagine stepping into a peasant hut after days of rain. Your tunic drips mud. Your bare feet are cracked and bleeding. The wool scratches your skin raw, but you cannot remove it. It's all you have. Lice crawl in the seams. Fleas bite at your ankles. The smell is overwhelming. Smoke, sweat, piss and damp wool. You lie down still clothed, because there is nothing else to wear tomorrow. This is your wardrobe. For peasants, clothing wasn't identity. It wasn't comfort. It was survival, stitched in filth. The body of a medieval peasant was not one of strength and vigour, as paintings sometimes suggest. It was bent, scarred, rotten with disease and constantly under siege from filth. To live as a peasant was to live in a body that never had a chance to heal. Start with hygiene, or rather the absence of it. Bathing was rare, often only a few times a year, sometimes less. Water was cold, filthy, and difficult to heat. Soap, when it existed, was harsh and scarce. Instead, peasants scrubbed themselves with sand, ashes, or rough cloth. Most simply, didn't bother. Skin became greasy, layered with sweat and soot. Wounds festered easily, crawling with dirt. Teeth were another misery. There were no toothbrushes, no dental care. Bread ground with stone mills carried grit, which wore enamel away quickly. By 30, many peasants had mouths full of rot. Gums swollen and bleeding, teeth blackened or missing. The stench of bad breath mixed with the ever-present stink of sweat and smoke. Parasites infested every body. Fleas, lice and bedbugs spread relentlessly. Worms thrived in guts, fed by poorly stored grain full of larvae. Bellies swelled grotesquely, especially in children, who cried from pain and hunger. Cuts from tools or accidents quickly turned septic, spreading infection that could kill in days. Malnutrition was constant. Diets lacked protein and vitamins, leaving peasants stunted, pale and weak. Rickets bent children's legs, scurvy rotted gums, pellagra ravaged skin. Women suffered anemia from endless childbirths, their bodies depleted until death came early. Work carved itself into every muscle and bone. Men's spines bent from ploughing, shoulders twisted from carrying loads, knees swelled from crouching in fields. Women, too, laboured endlessly, hauling water, spinning wool, reaping crops, bearing children. Their hands cracked, nails torn, backs broken. There were no days off, no healing time. An injury meant disaster. Sickness swept through villages like wildfire. Fevers, dysentery, and plague killed without mercy. Smoke-filled huts became breeding grounds for lung disease. Coughs rattled constantly in children's chests, sometimes lasting until they coughed blood. Diarrhea, often from contaminated water, dehydrated people into skeletons. Epidemics wiped out families overnight. Medicine was primitive. Healers offered herbs, charms, or prayers. Bleeding, purging, or applying dung poultices were common cures. Sometimes they helped, often they worsened the illness. The church said sickness was punishment for sin, urging prayer and penance rather than treatment. For peasants, survival meant enduring disease, not curing it. And through all this, the body smelled. It reeked of sweat, piss, manure, smoke and decay. Clothes rarely washed, bedding crawling with vermin, skin greasy with soot. Entering a hut was stepping into a suffocating cloud of odour. Imagine it. You are 30 years old, but look 50. Your back is bent, your teeth are gone, your skin pocked with scars. Worms twist in your belly, lice crawl in your hair. You cough until your chest aches, spit blood, then return to the field anyway. Because there is no choice. Work doesn't stop for sickness. Hunger doesn't wait. This was the body of a peasant. Fragile, filthy, exhausted. Survival didn't mean health. It meant enduring misery until the body finally broke. For the medieval peasant, justice wasn't blind. It wasn't fair. It was the hand of the Lord, and that hand was heavy. To be at the bottom of society meant you were always guilty, even before the trial began. The Lord's Manor Court was where most disputes landed. It wasn't a courtroom in the modern sense, but a gathering in a hall or even outdoors with the Lord Steward presiding. Here, peasants were judged for everything, from stealing wood to failing to pay taxes. And justice was rarely about truth. It was about maintaining order and reminding peasants of their place. Punishments were brutal, public, and humiliating. For small crimes like stealing bread or not paying rent, fines were common. But since peasants had little money, fines often meant losing livestock or tools, crippling a family's survival. Sometimes it meant days of unpaid labour for the Lord. For worse offences, punishments became physical. Thieves were whipped until their backs bled, dragged through mud as neighbours watched. Pillories and stocks displayed offenders in the village square. There people jeered, spat or threw filth. The humiliation was as harsh as the physical pain. A man could be left in the stocks for days, exposed to rain, sun and animals, his dignity stripped before all. And then there were executions. Hanging was the most common punishment for serious theft or violence. A wooden gallows stood near many villages, visible as a warning. Bodies sometimes dangled for days, crows pecking at their faces as a reminder of the Lord's power. Lesser lords who wanted to display cruelty ordered mutilations, cutting off ears, noses, or hands to mark criminals forever. Trials themselves were strange. Without lawyers or evidence as we know it, peasants were often forced to prove innocence through ordeals. One might plunge a hand into boiling water. If it healed clean, God had declared them innocent. Or they were bound and thrown into a pond. If they floated, it meant guilt, because water rejected the sinful. If they sank, innocence was proven, though often too late. Even disputes between neighbours could become deadly. A quarrel over land, a stolen chicken, or accusations of adultery might lead to fists, knives, or knives disguised as accidents. The court rarely cared who was right. What mattered was that the system stayed intact. Peasants below, lord above, and the church had its own punishments. Sin carried eternal consequences, and priests used fear to control behaviour. A thief risked not just whipping but damnation. A woman accused of adultery faced not only public shame but excommunication, cutting her off from God and community. To peasants, this was terrifying, worse than death itself. Imagine standing in the village square, wrists locked in the stocks. Your face burns as children throw dung at you, neighbours laugh, and the steward reads your crime aloud. You're cold, humiliated, and aching, but you can't escape. Tomorrow you'll return to the same fields, working alongside the same people who mocked you. Justice wasn't correction, it was domination. For medieval peasants, law wasn't protection, it was another chain. Every punishment, every trial, every hanging body on the gallows reminded them of the truth. Their lives didn't belong to them, they belonged to the system, and that system fed on their obedience. For kings and nobles, war was glory, banners flying, horses charging, songs of victory. For peasants, war was ruin. They didn't march at the head of armies, they felt war in the ashes of their homes, in empty granaries, in the screams of their children. When lords quarrelled, peasants paid first in taxes. Armies needed food, weapons, horses, coin, and that meant heavier demands on villages. Men already starving were forced to give up grain, animals, even tools. The Lord's tax collector arrived with armed men, sweeping barns bare. Families hid sacks of flour under floorboards, smuggled eggs into hedges, buried meat in the woods. If caught, punishment was brutal. Armies moved like locusts. Soldiers didn't carry months of food. They took it from the land they marched through. Villages, unlucky enough to be near battlefields, were stripped. Chickens vanished, sheep dragged off, barrels of ale cracked open. If peasants resisted, soldiers beat them or burned huts in warning. War turned the countryside into a feast for armies and a famine for the poor. Then came billeting. Soldiers quartered in huts, eating from peasant tables, sleeping in their beds, families crammed into corners, while armoured strangers snored on straw. Women were especially vulnerable. Chronicles speak in veiled language of dishonour and outrage, but the truth was worse. When armed men took what they wanted, peasants had no protection. Violence was constant. Battles rarely spared civilians. Fires spread, huts collapsed, crops trampled. After the soldiers left, villagers returned to charred ruins, dead animals, and empty fields. Hunger always followed, and yet lords still demanded service. Peasant men were sometimes conscripted as foot soldiers, armed with spears or bows. Poorly trained, poorly equipped, they marched at the edge of armies, often used as cannon fodder. Many never returned. Those who did came home scarred, maimed, or broken, unable to work the fields. Their families starved anyway. War also brought disease. Armies carried plague, dysentery, and fevers, spreading them from camp to village. A passing force could leave behind not just ashes, but sickness that killed for months afterward. For peasants, war was never over when the battle ended. Imagine it. Your village lies in the path of an army. Smoke rises as barns burn. Your hut fills with armed men demanding food. Your children cry as soldiers eat your last loaf of bread. Outside, animals scream as they're dragged away. You cower in silence, praying they don't notice your daughter, praying the night passes quickly. When they leave, you're left with ashes, hunger, and fear that they will return. For nobles, war was politics. For peasants, it was survival shattered. Their lives weren't their own. They were fuel for someone else's fight. Life for a medieval peasant was a treadmill of hunger and labour. But even on that treadmill, there were moments, brief, fragile, where joy broke through. Festivals and feasts were the cracks in the darkness, the escapes that kept peasants sane. The church calendar provided most of these moments. Saints' days, Easter, Christmas, Candlemas, May Day, each marked by rituals, masses, and processions. For peasants, these weren't just religious events. They were rare opportunities to stop working, eat something better than gruel, and feel part of something larger than their mud-stained huts. Food defined a festival. On feast days, villagers slaughtered animals that were too costly to keep through winter. Pork sizzled over open fires, stews bubbled with more meat than a family might see in months. Bread was baked fresh, honey cakes made if supplies allowed. Ale flowed freely. For a brief day, hunger loosened its grip. Bellies filled until people leaned back, sighing in disbelief. Alcohol transformed festivals. Small ale was daily fare, but during feasts stronger brews appeared. Ale and mead loosened tongues, sparked songs, and made the night wild. Dancing erupted in muddy village squares. Men and women joined hands, spinning until they stumbled, laughing with abandon. For a moment, misery was forgotten. Games and contests filled the air. Tug-of-war, wrestling, races, and games with sticks or balls. These weren't polite diversions. They were rough, loud, often violent. Bruises and broken bones were common, but laughter echoed louder than cries. Children ran free, chasing each other, while adults cheered and cursed, and with alcohol came loosened morals. Chronicles by priests grumble about peasants' indecency during festivals, the drinking, the dancing, the flirting in shadowed corners. Behind barns or hedges, couples disappeared for quick embraces. For many, these were the only moments of freedom, when the weight of the church's constant watch seemed to lift. May Day in particular was notorious. Villages erupted in greenery, ribbons, and dancing around maypoles. Songs rang out, fertility was celebrated openly, and chastity vows forgotten. Priests condemned it as sinful, but peasants clung to it, because for one day, life wasn't only about survival, it was about pleasure. Music filled every celebration. Fiddles, flutes, drums, and human voices lifted spirits. Songs mocked lords, praised ale, celebrated love and lust. Even illiterate peasants carried entire repertoires of ballads, passing them from generation to generation. Singing was rebellion, memory, and escape all at once. Imagine it. After months of hunger and smoke, you stand in a muddy square under torchlight. Ale warms your belly. Pork fat drips from your fingers. Music rings. Neighbours laugh. Children chase each other through the dark. You spin in a circle, dizzy with drink, forgetting for a few precious hours the taxes, the hunger, the wolves at the edge of the forest. Festivals didn't erase misery, but they gave peasants the strength to keep enduring it. Without them, the grind of labour might have broken them completely. If being a peasant was hard, being a peasant woman was harder still. She carried the same burdens of field work and survival, But on top of that, she bore children, managed households, and lived under the constant shadow of male authority. Her life was a cycle of work, childbirth, and exhaustion, often cut short before she reached old age. From childhood, girls were trained for labour. At 5 or 6, they helped mothers spin wool, fetch water, and tend animals. By their teens, they were working in the fields alongside men, reaping, weeding, sowing. There was no protection from heavy labour. A woman's body was expected to carry the same loads, endure the same blisters, and push through the same pain. Marriage often came early. Girls as young as 12 or 13 could be betrothed, especially if land or alliances were at stake. Weddings weren't romantic affairs, they were contracts. Consent was secondary. Many women entered adulthood already tied to a husband they barely knew. Their lives merged with his obligations. Childbirth defined much of a woman's existence. Medieval medicine offered little safety, and every pregnancy was a gamble. Women bore children often, 6, 8, sometimes more, but many didn't survive infancy, and many mothers died giving birth. Midwives offered herbs, prayers, or charms, but hemorrhage and infection were constant threats. A peasant woman might be considered old by 30, her body already broken by repeated pregnancies. Yet child rearing was only one part of her labour. Women also managed households. They cooked meals over smoky fires, brewed ale, spun and wove cloth, patched clothes, fetched water from distant wells, gathered firewood and cared for animals. Their day rarely ended. Even at night, they soothed crying babies, nursed the sick, or prepared food for the next morning. And when the lord or priest demanded dues, women felt the burden too. They handed over eggs, wool, or cheese. They trudged to church for confession. Often blamed for temptations or sins, the church preached that women were weaker, prone to lust, needing control. Eve's sin was laid on their shoulders. Domestic violence was common and largely accepted. Husbands had the legal right to discipline wives. Neighbours turned a blind eye unless injuries were extreme. Women who resisted or ran away faced shame, loss of children, and punishment. Their lives were bound not just to the land, but to their husbands' tempers. And yet women found resilience. They formed bonds with other women, at wells, in fields, during births. These spaces became moments of solidarity, where they shared gossip, remedies, and laughter. Some women became local authorities in their own right, skilled in midwifery or brewing, their knowledge passed secretly outside of church control. Imagine being a peasant woman of 25. You rise before dawn, your body aching from yesterday's harvest and from carrying your infant all night. You stoke the fire, grind grain, prepare bread. Then you walk to the field, sickle in hand, working until your back screams. At night, you return, nurse your child, patch clothes by firelight. Your hands are cracked, your womb scarred, your spirit worn thin, and yet tomorrow it begins again. For women, peasant life was more than toil. It was survival under constant strain, where strength was invisible and suffering unacknowledged. Death was never far from a medieval peasant's hut. It came with sickness, hunger, war, or accident, and it came often. Few lived beyond their 40s, many died in childhood, and almost every family buried loved ones yearly. To peasants, death wasn't shocking. It was as familiar as birth, woven into the rhythm of life. When someone died, the body usually remained in the hut until burial. In a smoky, crowded room, the dead lay on straw, while family members kept vigil. The smell of death mingled with smoke, manure, and sweat. Children cried quietly. Women whispered prayers. Men carved simple crosses. There was little ceremony, just weary grief. The church controlled burial rites. The priest came to perform prayers, sprinkle holy water, and remind mourners of sin and salvation. But even this came at a cost. Fees for funerals, offerings for prayers, tithes from estates. Death was another chance for the church to collect. Families already starving handed over their best animal or coin to secure a proper burial. Burial itself was crude. Cemeteries were crowded, graves dug shallow in frozen earth or muddy ground. Wooden markers rotted quickly, leaving many graves unmarked. Bones surfaced over time, disturbed by floods or new burials. Sometimes multiple bodies were placed in the same pit, layered by necessity. Despite the bleakness, rituals mattered. Families placed small tokens with the dead, a rosary, a toy, a scrap of cloth. Mothers kissed their children's cold faces one last time. Songs or laments might be whispered as earth fell on the coffin, if there even was one. Most peasants were buried wrapped in cloth, nailed boxes reserved for the wealthy. Fear surrounded death. Peasants worried about restless spirits, about improper burials leading to ghosts. Stones were laid over graves, charms whispered, candles lit to ward off wandering souls. Wolves sometimes dug shallow graves, scattering bones, a horrifying reminder of how fragile dignity was, even in death. The memory of the dead lived on in stories. Around hearths, families spoke of ancestors, recounting how they worked fields, fought hunger, or died tragically. Death wasn't just an end, it was a thread in the communal memory, tying generations together. Children learned who they were through tales of the dead, and yet grief was often muted. Families couldn't afford long mourning. The day after a burial, the fields still needed ploughing, the animals feeding. Life forced its way forward. Tears were wiped away with dirty hands, replaced by the grind of survival. Imagine standing in a muddy graveyard, the wind howling through bare trees. Your hands are numb, your stomach empty. You watch as earth is shoveled over the body of your child, or your parent, or your spouse. The priest mutters prayers, but your mind is elsewhere, on how you'll survive tonight, how you'll feed the living. Death hurts, but hunger bites harder. For peasants, funerals were less about closure and more about continuation. The dead passed into memory. The living carried on. Death wasn't an interruption, it was a constant companion. To understand the life of a medieval peasant, you have to see it as a circle, a year repeating itself over and over until the body gave out. There was no real progress, no dream of rising higher, just the endless rhythm of seasons, each bringing its own labours, its own hungers, its own fears. Spring began with ploughing and sowing. Fields were scratched open with wooden ploughs, seeds scattered, prayers whispered for good weather. Children drove away birds, men bent their backs to the earth, women worked beside them. Hope was fragile, but it was all they had. Summer was growth and weeding, hours stretched under burning suns, bodies dripping with sweat, insects biting, soil clinging to bare legs. The air filled with the smell of manure and smoke from cooking fires. Every stalk mattered. Every weed pulled a battle for survival. Autumn was harvest, frantic and exhausting. Sickles sliced, bundles stacked, barns filled. It was the most crucial time of the year, the difference between survival and famine. Even children carried sheaves, women sang songs to keep rhythm. Neighbours helped neighbours. At night, villagers collapsed into huts, too tired even to speak. Winter was endurance. Grain dwindled, bread shrank, bellies growled. Families huddled in smoky huts, coughing, shivering, waiting. Fires had to be fed, roofs patched, animals kept alive. Death came most in winter, from hunger, cold, or plague. Every winter was a gamble, every spring a victory. The cycle repeated year after year. There was no escaping it. A child born in a peasant hut could expect to live and die within that rhythm, as their parents had, as their children would. Even rebellion against it, fleeing the village, joining a band of outlaws, taking up arms in revolt, almost always ended in capture and punishment. The circle pulled everyone back in. Religion sanctified the cycle. Priests told peasants their suffering was holy, their hunger a trial that earned them heaven. Lords told peasants their labour was duty, their rent a necessity ordained by God. Together, church and nobility wrapped the cycle in chains, making it not just a way of life, but a divine order. And yet, within that cycle, peasants carved out humanity. They laughed at festivals, fell in love under maypoles, sang songs while spinning wool, told stories to their children by smoky fires. They mourned their dead. They celebrated births. They whispered jokes about greedy priests and cruel lords. Even in endless toil, they clung to scraps of joy. Imagine standing at the edge of a field at dawn, frost still clinging to the grass. Behind you, smoke curls from the hut where your family sleeps. Ahead, the soil waits, dark and heavy. You take up the plough, knowing this day will be like yesterday and like tomorrow. Your back aches, your stomach is already hollow, but your hands move anyway, because this is life. The life of a medieval peasant was filth, hunger, and labour. But it was also resilience, the ability to endure, to survive, to pass life forward in the face of misery. They didn't leave behind castles or chronicles. They left behind generations, and without them, the lords and kings we remember could never have existed. So as you sit warm tonight, maybe with a full belly and a soft bed, take a moment. The peasants of medieval Europe lived and died in dirt so that the rest of history could stand on their backs. That was what it was like to be a medieval peasant, trapped in the endless cycle of survival, but stubbornly human within it. When we think of peasants, it's easy to imagine endless drudgery, bent backs in fields, smoke-filled huts and nothing else. But even the poorest, even the most overworked, craved escape. Leisure, though rare, existed, and when it did, it often shocked priests and lords who tried desperately to control it. First, there was the tavern. Even in small villages, someone brewed ale strong enough to sell. For a few pennies, peasants crowded into low smoky rooms, mugs clutched in rough hands, laughter echoed, song slurred, dice clattered across wooden tables. For many, the tavern was the only place where class briefly blurred, where men could curse their lord under their breath and feel, if only for a few hours, like masters of their own voices. Alcohol was central. Small ale was daily fuel, but tavern ale was stronger, thicker, enough to numb pain and loosen tongues. With enough drink, peasants mocked priests, argued over fields, or sang bawdy songs that scandalised any passing outsider. Women joined too, brewing, serving, or drinking alongside men. For some, the tavern became the place where flirtation turned into stolen embraces in corners, or whispered promises under flickering lamplight. Gambling was another forbidden joy. Dice made from bones, cards in later centuries, or simple wagers on wrestling matches, all were condemned by the church as sinful, but irresistible to peasants. A lucky throw might win a few coins or a chicken, a dangerous temptation when hunger pressed at home. Fights broke out when losses stung, leading to bruises, broken noses, sometimes worse. Music and storytelling also filled rare evenings. Around the fire, villagers passed tales of saints, monsters, and tricksters. Some sang songs mocking lords, slyly coded so only peasants laughed. Dancing was common, rough stomping in circles, hand-clapping rhythms, wild and earthy. Priests often complained about the indecency of mixed dancing, warning that such movements led to sin. But peasants didn't stop. Joy was too precious. And then there were the pleasures whispered about in confessionals, the ones that shocked clergy most. Court records speak of adultery cases, fornication in barns, and midnight trysts in fields. When your home was one smoky room shared with your whole family, privacy was impossible. Couples stole moments wherever they could. Hedges, stables, riverbanks. Priests thundered against lust, but bodies still sought warmth. Festivals turned this into chaos. May Day especially horrified moralists. Men and women disappeared into woods after dancing, returning rumpled and grinning. Babies born 9 months later were called May children, their paternity sometimes uncertain. The church tried to stamp out such practices, calling them pagan remnants, but they survived stubbornly. There were darker escapes too. Records mention villagers dabbling in charms and love potions. Women mixed herbs to attract men or prevent pregnancy. Others whispered spells at wells, tied knots in cords, or left offerings in forests. Officially condemned as witchcraft, these acts continued, passed quietly from mother to daughter. For peasants, they weren't sin, they were survival and desire expressed in secret. Imagine sitting in a tavern, the smell of ale and sweat thick in the air. You roll dice in your palm, hoping luck turns in your favour. Around you, laughter rises, a fiddler scrapes a rough tune. Couples sneak glances at each other through candlelight. For a few hours the world feels lighter. Taxes, hunger, and toil fall away, replaced by warmth, drink, and fleeting freedom. Tomorrow will be the same grind, but tonight you live. Leisure didn't erase the misery of peasant life, but it reminded them they were more than beasts of burden. They were human with desires, joy, and rebellion, and in a world that crushed them daily, that humanity was the greatest act of defiance. For peasants, the line between survival and crime was razor thin. When hunger clawed too deep, when taxes stripped barns bare, when winter gnawed at bones, some crossed it. Not because they were wicked, but because law itself left no other choice. The most common crime was theft, grain stolen from fields, chickens snatched in the night, wood cut from the Lord's forest. These were desperate acts. A stolen sack of flour could feed a family for a week. But punishments were brutal. Whippings, fines, mutilations, even hangings. Chronicles describe peasants executed for crimes as small as taking a rabbit. Justice protected the Lord's wealth, not the village's survival. Wood theft was especially common. Lords tightly controlled forests, claiming all timber, game, and grazing rights. But peasants needed firewood to live through winters, so they crept into forests at night, axes muffled, carrying branches on their backs. If caught, they were dragged to manor courts, fined beyond their means, sometimes left destitute. Yet they kept doing it, because freezing was worse. Some peasants turned to poaching. Deer, boar, and hares were technically reserved for nobles, but traps and snares hidden in forests gave desperate families meat. Poachers risked mutilation, hands cut off, or even death. Yet the temptation of a fresh haunch of venison was too great. For the most desperate, outlawry beckoned. Men who fled debts, crimes, or punishments vanished into forests, joining bands of thieves. Outlaws lived beyond the law, raiding roads, robbing travellers, sometimes even raiding villages. Songs later romanticised them. Robin Hood, the noble thief, But reality was harsher. Most outlaws were hunted down, hanged, or starved in the wild. Still, the idea that peasants could strike back, even in lawless ways, kept the stories alive. Rebellion was rarer, but it came. When taxes grew unbearable, when lords demanded too much, entire villages rose. Pitchforks, flails, and sickles became weapons. Manor houses were stormed, records burned, barns looted. For a brief moment, peasants tasted freedom, shouting their rage at the system that ground them down. But rebellion almost always ended the same way, crushed by armoured knights, bodies hanging in rows as warnings. Yet peasants remembered. Around fires, stories of rebels lived on. The names of those who defied lords became whispered legends. Some villages quietly honoured them, even as priests called them sinners. The desire for justice simmered, waiting for another spark. Crime wasn't just rebellion, it was survival strategy. Families weighed risks nightly. Steal wood and risk whipping or freeze. Hide a pig from the Lord's tax collector, or starve. For peasants, morality was twisted by desperation. Sin was secondary to hunger. Imagine yourself slipping into the forest on a moonless night. Your stomach growls. Your children cry back in the hut. You clutch an axe, scanning for guards, every sound amplified. You cut a branch, heart pounding, and hide it under your cloak. Each step back is terror. If caught, you might lose a hand. But if you return empty, your family might not last the winter. This is the gamble every peasant understood. Crime, outlawry, rebellion. These weren't choices of luxury. They were the cracks where human desperation burst through a system designed to keep peasants trapped. And though lords crushed them, the echoes never disappeared. After long days of labour, after hunger and fear, what did peasants have left? Stories, songs, whispers in the dark. For a class that left few written words, folklore was their treasure, their entertainment, and sometimes their only comfort. Nights in smoky huts were filled with tales. Grandmothers spun yarns of saints performing miracles, of spirits haunting crossroads, of animals that spoke. Children listened wide-eyed, clutching rags against the cold, while shadows from the fire danced like demons on the walls. Every story carried warnings. Don't walk into the forest at night. Don't whistle after sunset. Don't trust a stranger with glowing eyes. Fear kept peasants safe where laws could not. Superstition was everywhere. If a cow fell ill, it was the work of a witch. If crops failed, demons had spoiled the soil. Amulets of bone or herbs hung above doors. Prayers were carved into beams. Villagers whispered charms before bed, spat over shoulders to ward off evil, or tied knots in cords to protect children. The church thundered against these practices, but peasants clung to them. Faith in saints mixed with fear of spirits, and together they created a world where everything, every sound, every shadow, carried meaning. Music and dance also filled the gaps. Fiddles, flutes, drums, and human voices echoed at weddings, festivals, even funerals. Songs were bawdy, mocking lords, celebrating ale, or warning of ghosts. Dancing was rough, earthy, sometimes scandalous. Priests called it sinful, but peasants laughed louder. Games were crude but joyous. Wrestling matches in muddy fields, ball games with pig bladders, dice clattering on tavern tables. Risk, pain, laughter, all blurred together. Even children found joy chasing geese or racing barefoot through muck. Entertainment was survival of another kind. And yet, fear always crept back. Wolves howled from forests. Plague spread silently. The gallows loomed on the hill. Even in joy, peasants lived with death in the corner of every room. But that didn't erase their humanity. It sharpened it. Because in their laughter, their stories, their dances, peasants proved they weren't just fuel for the system. They were people. Imagine a winter's night, snow piles against the hut, smoke curls from the fire. You sit with neighbours, the day's hunger momentarily forgotten. An old man sings a ballad of a hero who defied a cruel lord. Children laugh nervously at ghost stories. Someone rolls dice, another pours ale. For a brief moment, you feel alive, connected, defiant in your own small way. This was the life of the medieval peasant. Endless labour, crushing taxes, hunger, sickness and fear. But also laughter, songs, love and stubborn survival. They had little, but they made meaning out of scraps. And in doing so, they kept humanity alive in the darkest corners of history. So when you think of peasants as nameless faces in the mud, remember, they were the backbone of medieval society. Without them, there would have been no castles, no cathedrals, no kings. Their stories may not fill books, but they echo in every stone laid, every field ploughed, every village that once stood. The medieval peasant's life was misery, yeah, but it was also resilience. And that resilience carried Europe through centuries of darkness.